Navigating differences with China, all in with the British on nuclear submarines and buckling up for a potential return of Donald Trump to the White House. In 1 week, the directions, difficulties and dilemmas of Australian diplomacy have all been on show. I'm David Speers. Welcome to Insiders. Old ties with the United Kingdom are being strengthened once more. A new security pact has been signed and Australia has agreed to pump more than $4.5 billion into British facilities to help build nuclear submarines. AUKUS skeptics say Australia's being taken for a ride, but the Defence Minister insists it's a good deal. No one knows for sure how Donald Trump might feel about AUKUS if he returns to the White House, but it seems he's not a fan of Australia's ambassador, Kevin Rudd. This whole ramp-up in defence spending and alliance strengthening is being done with an eye to China, whose foreign minister also paid a visit during this busy week of diplomacy. Wang Yi made a point of meeting not just the foreign minister, but Australia's biggest AUKUS critic, Paul Keating.
Thank you for coming to Australia. Yes, so sorry about that.
From human rights to crippling wine tariffs, high-level talks have been underway today as China's foreign minister toured Canberra.
Australia will always be Australia and China will always be China.
Our common interests far outweigh the differences.
But some conflicts can't be wished away.
We will not walk away from our advocacy for Dr. Youngjohn.
There's been a meeting between Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, and former Australian Prime Minister Paul Keating. They've chosen a former Prime Minister who is a loud and vocal critic of Penny Wong and the Albanese government.
Now, another headline from Donald Trump.
And he sounded an ominous warning.
Kevin Rudd has copped a blistering serve from Donald Trump.
He has said the most horrible things. You were a destructive president, a traitor to the West.
He won't be there long if that's the case.
Will the government keep Kevin Rudd as ambassador if Donald Trump returns to the White House?
The answer is yes. He is recognised and is doing an excellent job.
I don't know much about him. I heard he was a little bit nasty. I hear he's not the brightest bulb.
We want him to do well.
Rudd's cooked.
Kevin Rudd is right. Donald Trump is dangerous.
Dr. Rudd is a very distinguished diplomat and he's well respected overseas.
I couldn't see whether Bill was reading from a script. It sounded like one of those sausage videos.
Australia and the UK formalising allegiances in troubled times, making it easier to host each other's forces.
It does reflect a relationship which has become much more strategic.
We've been increasing our defence budget.
Taxpayers will fork out almost $5 billion to upgrade the UK's Rolls-Royce factory.
There are jobs provided both here but also at home in the United Kingdom as well.
They have been looking around the world for a sucker to subsidise them.
An old relationship now closely forged in a new, expensive military collaboration.
It is a partnership which is being transformed to meet the challenges of our times. You are true friends and we look forward to many more years of this.
Well, my guest this morning is the Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister Richard Marles. First, let's check what's making news. And Tasmanians have voted for a hung parliament, with the Liberal Party winning the most seats at the close of counting last night. We'll hear more on this from Chief Election Analyst Anthony Green in a moment. In the 9 newspapers, major infrastructure projects like Western Sydney Airport and the suburban rail loop in Melbourne will stymie the government's ability to deliver its flagship housing goal. That's according to the government's own agency, Build Skills Australia, which says more skilled tradies need to be brought in and productivity stepped up to create the workforce needed to build 1.2 million new homes by 2029. In News Corp papers, a new task force will crack down on providers charging NDIS participants more than non-participants for identical services. Every participant will receive a letter from this week letting them know what action they can take to stop rip-offs. In some pre-selection news, the Liberal Party has chosen Amelia Hamer, a 31-year-old Oxford graduate, to take on Independent MP Monique Ryan in Kooyong. And former New South Wales Liberal Minister Andrew Constance is set to have his 5th tilt at winning a seat in federal parliament, once again in the seat of Gilmore on the New South Wales south coast. And here's one you don't see too often. The Malinowskis Labor government in South Australia is on track to win yesterday's Dunstan by-election. If confirmed, it will be the first time in 116 years an incumbent government in the state has won a seat from the opposition. It was a bad night for the South Australian Liberals, a good night for the Greens, who picked up a big swing, boosting their hopes in the federal seat of Sturt. Now let's take a closer look at the Tasmanian election result last night. The Liberals are most likely to form a minority government, winning the most seats, despite copping a 12% swing against them. Premier Jeremy Ratcliffe called the early election on the grounds he needed stability. Instead, he'll face an even bigger crossbench.
Tasmanians have delivered a very clear message, and I want to assure each and every Tasmanian that we've heard it, and I thank you for it. But Tasmanians have not voted for a change of government. Make no mistake, this has been a very poor result for the Labor Party of Tasmania.
Humble people don't speak of a coalition of chaos whenever they don't get their own way, or claim a victory when the results aren't clear.
Well, the Labor leader there wasn't conceding defeat last night, and it could be weeks before we know exactly who's made it into the new parliament and what the minority government will look like. Anthony Green gave us this wrap-up of where the count ended last night.
Well, David, it's been quite an inconclusive result in the end. If we look at the votes recorded by the parties, the Liberals are down to 37.6, Labor 28.29, the Greens 13, Jackie Lambie Network 6.7, Independents. If you look at the change in votes since the last election, all the losses have been from the Liberal side and mostly to the crossbench. For the Greens and the Labor Party, their vote is basically unchanged on a decade ago when they lost government. In 2014, when the Liberals came to power, they got over 50% of the vote. They still had in the high 40s at the last election. Now they're down in the high 30s. So it's the Liberal Party that's lost vote, but certainly the Labor Party and the Greens have not gained significantly. The Green gains in terms of seats, and if we have a look at the chamber and the size of the crossbench, based on likelies, we think the Greens may increase from 2 to 5. The lower quota and the increase in Parliament has delivered the Greens some extra seats. It's also delivered 2 independents and maybe some Jackie Lambie Network members. So the Liberals can't get above 16. So they're going to have a very difficult time governing with that Parliament, with tough decisions like what are they going to do with the AFL team and the AFL stadium at Macquarie Point.
Anthony Green, thank you very much for that. Let's bring in our panel. Very good morning to Clare Armstrong, Anthony Galloway and Shalailah Medhora. Great to see you all. Clare, you're our resident Tasmanian. You're from the state. Not a great night for the major parties. The Liberal vote down, as we saw, 12%. Labor still stuck below 30% primary vote. The miners have done well. What's going to happen now?
Well, the funny thing is we really don't know for possibly weeks due to the count taking so long, but it seems likely that the 3 or 4 Jackie Lambie MPs that Tasmania is likely to have will end up being the kingmakers, if you will, of who out of the major parties forms a minority government. Yeah, king or queen makers, because either side will need, whichever way you slice it at the moment, I think that's right, isn't it? They're still going to need, if Jackie Lambie has 2 or 3, the Jackie Lambie Network, either side would need those to form a government. Yeah, if you assume more than likely that obviously the Greens would side with Labor, that puts them roughly at the same distance from the needed 18 seats to be government. So that makes those few seats that Jackie's candidates are looking to secure pretty crucial. I think interestingly though, there's been a lot around whether they will what kind of support they will offer, whether it's actually to form a minority government or if it's some kind of lesser deal of just supplying confidence. Because Jackie Lambie, listening to her last night on the ABC coverage, she's not happy with the Libs at all. They went pretty hard against her party. Dirty tricks, she called it, a fake website they set up that I think was called the network of Jackie Lambie rather than the Jackie Lambie Network or something. And anyway, she was not happy with all of that.
But it looks like, Anthony, you know, the party will have to make a call one way or another. They're a protest party, but they're going to have to decide whether they're going to back the Liberals or not.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a lesson that if you're going to go that hard in setting up a parody website to slam Jackie Lambie, you better be sure you're going to get a majority. I think that was definitely an error on the Liberals' part.
Yeah, they were backpedaling a bit last night, weren't they?
Exactly.
Nearly immediately as well.
Suddenly all the talk of chaos and confusion of a minority government is...
We'll work with it,
Yeah, I mean, Labor's going to have to decide if they are serious about forming a government, they need to give Greens ministries, surely. It's looking like they only have 10 seats, the Greens 6, so they can't without that.
It's interesting on that point because history shows that backfired a little bit for the Greens the last time Labor handed them ministries. Nick McKim, now in the federal parliament, was made education minister in the Tasmanian parliament and put in charge of shutting down a lot of regional schools, which obviously didn't make him particularly popular in the state. So I actually do agree that Labor probably need to bring them in, or either side are going to need to bring these minor parties into the tent. But whether they want the ministry as well is going to be interesting.
Yeah, so Labor would need the Greens plus the Jackie Lambie network and maybe another independent. It's easier for the Libs, but they've still got to get Jackie Lambie over the line, and there's bad blood there at the moment. So it could take a while. Federal implications, I think we always need to be pretty wary about. Yes, voters do tend to know the difference between state and federal. Nonetheless, when you look at those seats in the north of the state, which so often decide federal election outcomes, Bass and Braddon, that's where Jackie Lambie's done really well. The Liberal votes come right off in Bass. I know Bridget Archer, the federal MP, she has her own brand, so that might be a different factor. But they're going to need preferences from Jackie Lambie, it looks like, come federal election time.
I think there's two things that are really important to say about the federal implications. One, it's really interesting that Dutton didn't at all through the 5 or 6 week campaign in Tasmania or even visit Tasmania, and I wonder how much that has to do with the fact that Jeremy Rockliff is a moderate. His predecessor, Peter Gutman, was also a very, very popular moderate, and whether that's a sense of differentiating from the Liberal brand federally. Also, what I always say after every federal election is this is another example of when major parties don't look to young voters, don't speak to young voters, don't consider their needs, they get whacked. We've seen that in the last federal election. This particular election had a couple of policies towards housing, which I would argue is no longer a youth issue. It's actually quite multi-generational. But beyond that, there really wasn't a whole pitch to Tasmanians when it came to young Tasmanians. We know Tasmania has a massive issue with brain drain when it comes to young professionals leaving and going to the mainland and studying or working. And there really was nothing to combat these really large demographic issues that Tasmania had. And obviously in the weeks we will find out how that pans out, and there will be more analysis on this. But on the first kind of view of the results, definite implications here.
What happens to the Hobart Stadium, Anthony, which Jeremy Rockliff, did the deal to build this expensive stadium, and Jackie Lambie said, stick it up somewhere.
Yeah, she's not a fan of the stadium.
She's called for transparency. She hasn't completely said do nothing.
Yeah, but I do think it has some other implications for the major parties if they're going to try and kind of trade off this populist route with things like stadiums. So Labor did not, despite being opposed to Jeremy Rockliff's position on the stadium, Labor did not benefit. Jackie Lambie benefited. Now, I just question whether in Queensland there's some implications there with the government seeming to make a bit of a mess of the Olympics. Queenslanders may not like the rebuild of the Gabba, but they don't want to lose the Olympics, just like Tasmanians may not have liked the exact proposal that...
But they want the footy team.
Yes, they want the footy team.
It boils down to money, right? And people are really keenly aware of the fact that while we're in a cost of living crisis personally, that state and territory governments also are in a cost of living crisis, and they're questioning value for money. I think that's what it boils down to, is that people might have a personal sentiment towards, say, having an AFL team, but when they're like, does that mean that we have fewer doctors or fewer public schools? That's when the rubber.
I guess my point is Labor didn't have an alternative proposal for the stadium. They just said they were going to renegotiate with the AFL.
Clearer.
Yeah.
The only other thing I would just say, picking up on the federal implications for this, is I think it's a lesson for the major parties in how to talk about the possibility of a minority government. I would be very surprised if Jeremy Rockcliffe is still Premier in 12 months' time if he does manage to form minority government, because he pulled the trigger on this election a year early, seeking to get a majority government. And when you have had election after election where the trend is generally away from major parties, although they course correct often after a minority government, I don't think you can say chaos and misery.
I agree. I think
minority governments
this
are not
line
what
that it's going to be the worst thing in the world, and then suddenly, of course, on election night, all that stops. We need a more mature debate about, particularly in a smaller state like Tasmania. Yes, you can actually work in
it's
minority.
Also local. It's strong local candidates. It boils down to people who voters feel are taking their concerns seriously. And that's oftentimes major parties will launch in candidates who are high profile but have no connection to a community. And I think that's the real lesson as well.
Let's turn to this big week of diplomacy. And there's a few things to talk about here. I think the visit of the Chinese Foreign Minister went as smoothly as both sides might have hoped. The sort of difficulties that we knew were going to be raised were raised. The British Foreign and Defence Secretaries, again, it all went as planned. The curveball was clearly Donald Trump and what he's had to say about Kevin Rudd. Claire, how much of a potential problem is this for Australia?
Well, I mean, it depends on if Trump ends up president again, and it depends on if he remembers it and has people around him reminding him of this. I think an important thing that maybe got lost in the initial fallout from his comments were he had to be repeatedly explained who Kevin Rudd was.
Well, Nigel Farage had to spell it all out.
Read out the quotes. So I think, yes, should someone at a moment in a future Trump presidency remind him that that guy sitting down in the embassy is not your friend, it could become an issue.
But it's a good point, right? Because Trump too can change his mind. We've seen this. I want to show you this because whether it was the North Korean leader or even the Pope, Donald Trump can go from bagging out to best friends pretty quickly.
Rocket Man should have been handled a long time ago, and we would go back and forth, and then we fell in love. Okay? No, really. He wrote me beautiful letters, and they're great letters. We fell in love. For a religious leader to question a person's faith is disgraceful. Melania and I were greatly honored to visit the Vatican and meet Pope Francis. He was really wonderful, a great guy.
So, Anthony, maybe Kevin Rudd needs to write some beautiful letters, I don't know. But look, he can change his mind, but he can also punish. We know this. The British ambassador, back when he was president, had to go back home.
He had to go back home. Some leaked cables of him criticising
Trump came out and he was done.
It can happen. I mean, those are more contemporaneous comments, so Trump was reacting in real time. But I agree with Claire. The silver lining is he appeared to have no idea who Rudd was. So it's kind of positive that no one kind of in the Trump inner circle kind of raised it with Trump, and it's been an issue so far. The negative is Nigel Farage has now raised it.
Yeah, well, Steve Bannon, who's close to Trump, only a few weeks back was making similar criticisms of Kevin Rudd, saying that he's on our radar. Yeah. So it may still be a problem, and it raises the bigger question too: how prepared is Australia for a possible Trump presidency?
Look, if Donald Trump becomes president again, Kevin Rudd is the least of our concerns. I mean, he showed through his last presidency that he's very willing to talk smack about his allies while also embracing people who might not have the US's best interests at heart. So we know from history that Donald Trump is in it for Donald Trump. Whether that means that the Australian government is preparing for that possibility in the future. The difference this time around is that there isn't the sort of quiet workers in the background trying to fix diplomatic issues as they arise. This time around, we will potentially see Trump stacking a lot of government and a lot of bureaucracy with his own people and people who are so unwilling to rock the boat against him. And that is the difference this time around, that we actually might see a more emboldened Trump as president.
There'll be less of those kind of old school Republicans that were in the first Trump administration. It's going to be the Trump diehards more. And
what about in the Parliament this week with the Liberals raising this, saying, will the government reassess Rudd's appointment as ambassador because of this? I mean, Anthony Albanese was pretty fired up. He was pretty angry that they'd gone there.
Yeah, I don't know that it really achieved anything for the Libs. It wasn't the message that they were necessarily best prosecuting that day in question time, and obviously looked pretty silly when their own ranks had effectively endorsed Rudd being there. It's obviously the US, like the UK, positions that they tend to be more political, but once the person's there, it's hardly in the nation's interest to start those kind of pot shots. I think really the issue for the Libs going forward now is that, well, they've made a big deal out of it. Was that because there was internal pressure? And if so, if there's an incident in the future, are they going to now have to keep pursuing this issue?
When Paul Fletcher asked that question, every single Australian news site in the country across the ideological spectrum had the story at the top of their homepage.
Yeah.
So to go to your point,
but it wasn't the Libs.
It gave Albanese a free kick about the opposition politicising national security, a complete own goal, I thought.
Well, time to talk to the Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles, who has been busy progressing the AUKUS deal with his British counterparts. Australia will spend $4.6 billion to help expand a Rolls-Royce nuclear reactor facility in the English Midlands and contribute to the design of the new AUKUS submarines. They'll eventually be built at the Osborne shipyards in Adelaide, but the spectre of Donald Trump still looms over this whole deal. He's ahead in the polls in the United States, and it is still unclear what he thinks of AUKUS. But we now know what he thinks of Australia's ambassador, after, as we mentioned, he was told about some of Kevin Rudd's previous criticism. Before he was appointed ambassador, the former PM called Donald Trump the most destructive president in history and said he drags America and democracy through the mud.
I think the general consensus amongst anyone concerned with the public policy process, domestic or international, thinks he's nuts.
He won't be there long if that's the case. I don't know much about him. I heard he was a little bit nasty. I hear he's not the brightest bulb, but I don't know much about him. But if he's at all hostile, he will not be there long.
Richard Marles, welcome to the program.
Morning, David.
So when the government appointed Kevin Rudd as ambassador, was the thinking that there was little chance of Donald Trump ever returning?
When we appointed Kevin as ambassador, we saw Kevin as somebody who has a lot of experience and skill in diplomacy, having really grown up as a diplomat, as somebody who would bring a lot of prestige to the relationship as a former Prime Minister, and all of that has been put into action since he's been the ambassador to the United States. I mean, we have seen Kevin working at a pace in getting legislation or lobbying in respect of legislation in the Congress across the political spectrum with Democrats and Republicans alike, and he's doing a great job.
That may be true, but you knew he was a prolific critic of Donald Trump. I mean, the question is, how did you factor that in? Did you just not worry that Trump would be back?
Well, the American election is going to play out. I think we have a sense of confidence that no matter what the result is in November, the relationship between our two countries will be strong. Obviously, the relationship has experienced a Trump presidency before, and the relationship went through that period of time well. So, you know, we do have a sense of confidence of being able to work across the political spectrum, and we had a sense of confidence that Kevin would be able to do that, and he has.
So just on
his effort in the lead up to the Congress vote last year was fantastic, and again across the political spectrum.
So just on this question of the bigger question here of how to prepare for a second Trump presidency should it happen, what are you doing? Who are you talking to in his inner circle?
Oh, well, I mean, I'm hardly likely to go through answer that publicly.
Is there anyone, though, just without naming names? Are you talking to anyone?
Well, we are doing everything you would imagine that we would do in the lead up to an American
What's that?
election.
I'm just trying to imagine it.
Well, again, I'm not going to go through that publicly. We work very closely with the Biden administration, as we will work closely with the incumbent administration in America at any moment in time. And that's where our efforts are at. In saying that, we know they've got an election in November, and we feel confident that we will be able to work with whoever the American people choose come November. And that's where it's at.
But surely you can tell us whether you're talking to anyone close to Trump.
Well, we are doing everything you would expect us to be doing at this time. I mean, that's all I would say. I don't think it is sensible for me to start articulating to you all the conversations that happen in the background, but we work across the political spectrum.
And have you got any assurance that he would back AUKUS?
We need to work across the political spectrum, not just in terms of who ultimately wins elections in November, but because given the American system, there is legislation which is in front of Congress. There was in November, December. You need the support of the entire political spectrum in America to get things done, and that's what we've done. I mean, in terms of AUKUS, with a Trump presidency, we've got no reason to have any sense that it will be anything other than supportive, because again, when you look at what occurred in Congress last year with historic votes in respect of both pillars of AUKUS, there was unanimous support really across the political spectrum, Democrats and Republicans alike, and within the Republicans, those who support Donald Trump as well. So, I mean, we have a sense of confidence about the support across the spectrum for AUKUS. It makes strategic sense for the United States.
Let's talk about these nuclear submarines. When you and your colleague, the Defence Industry Minister, Pat Conroy, announced the AUKUS deal 12 months ago, here's what we were told about how much we'd be giving the US and the UK.
We will be spending slightly over $3 billion on industrial uplift in the United States and the United Kingdom over the next 4 years. The vast majority of that money will be in the United States.
So slightly over $3 billion, the vast majority in the United States. Since then, you've announced more than $4.5 billion to upgrade the US submarine industrial base, and now more than $4.5 billion to upgrade British facilities. Has the cost already blown out?
No, time frame, David. I mean, we're talking about a period of 10 years now. And so the $4.7 billion for the Rolls-Royce facility in Derby, which is where the nuclear reactors for our submarines will be built, something that we made really clear at the outset, that we wouldn't be building those reactors in Australia for obvious reasons. I mean, it would take a long time to have that kind of technology in Australia. It would delay submarines dramatically. This 4.7 is over 10.
So what's over 4? What's over the forward estimates?
Well, the profile of that 4.7 is again something that we'll work through with the UK. So we've not announced a profile of the 4.7,
you don't know yet,
but the 4.7. We have a sense, but we're working that through with the UK. But I'm, again, not going to go into that now. But the 4.7 is over 10, and that explains the difference in the numbers that you with the clip that you just played before.
But the reason I'm asking here, yeah, sorry, you go on.
Well, the point I want to make is that what we said a year ago was that there would be $9 billion over the forwards, but $50 to $58 billion over a 10-year period. And so what we have announced today is, or over the last few days, is fully provided in the announcement that we made a year ago of that $50 to $58 billion over the next decade.
So the $9 billion over the forwards, as you mentioned there, which was all to be offset by cancelling the French subs and then cutting some other defence programs. Is that still the case, or are you having to find more money now to pay for what you're announcing?
No, that $9 billion is still the case. I mean, that's $9 billion over the forwards from last year, and so obviously, you know, there's another year out and onto that now when we go into this coming budget. But the budget is still where we expected it to be in terms of AUKUS. And so we've heard the opposition try to muddy this up. I mean, they can say what they say, but it doesn't matter how much they talk about money. It doesn't distract from the facts, and the facts are money has been provided, and an increase in money has been provided to the defence budget. I mean, one thing that happened last year with the defence budget, which has not got a lot of airplay, is that we put an additional $30 billion into the defence budget over the decade. Just a few weeks ago, when we announced the Surface Fleet Review, we put another $11.1 billion into the budget over the course of the decade. When we measure that from this year over the next 10, it's something in the order of $50 $50 billion difference compared to what we inherited when we came to power. And in simple terms, what that means is that through to about 2033, we're taking the defence budget to 2.4% of GDP. What we inherited over that period of time was a trajectory of 2.1. That is a massive increase in the peacetime budget of Australia, as significant as we have ever seen. Right now, the Liberals are still stuck on supporting 2.1% of GDP over that time frame. We're at 2.4, and no matter what they say and what their supporters say, the facts are the facts in terms of the budgetary decisions that we've made.
So the money
we've increased defence spending, and the money is there for AUKUS.
Okay, so the money that is going to the UK, some analysts are worried about the existing backlogs in British shipbuilding at the moment. Your British counterpart says the dreadnought submarines in particular are the top priority. Will the AUKUS subs be at the end of the queue, if you like, for the British when it comes to their astute and dreadnought submarines coming first?
Well, no. It'll be for the appropriate time when our submarines are due. So, in the case of SSN AUKUS, which is what will be built in Adelaide, with the first rolling off the production line in the early 2040s, what we have done in the money that we have provided is to enable the Rolls-Royce factory in Derby to operate at an increased rate of production, which will enable the first of those, will enable a reactor to be able to put into that submarine on time and thereafter. I mean, to give you a sense of that,
they keep having these delays and overruns in their shipbuilding. Are you worried about that?
Well, we knew that the industrial base, both in the UK and the US, was stretched, which is why we made the decision last year to make a contribution to the industrial bases of both countries in order to allow them to do what they needed to do to enable Australia to acquire this capability. In the case of the UK, to have the nuclear reactors built in an appropriate time frame. In the case of the United States, to see that their production rate of Virginias was such that we could see 3 Virginias being provided to Australia during the 2030s.
The Pentagon only wants to make one next year, so there's an issue there too, isn't there?
There's not an issue in the sense that it speaks exactly to the point that I'm making, David. I mean, the one that is there for 2025 speaks to the stretched industrial base in the US that we understood a year ago, which is why we are making a contribution to the American industrial base. But I mean, the last couple of days, the US Navy has put out its regular shipbuilding program over over the next decade and beyond. AUKUS is entrenched in that. It makes clear in that that there will be a provision of 3 Virginia-class submarines to Australia during the 2030s. It is entirely factored in to how America is now thinking about their own construction of Virginia-class submarines.
Okay.
And we knew that the production rate needed to be increased in the US, which is why we're making the contributions that we're making.
Perhaps
so in a sense, people can't have it, but can I make this point, David? People can't have it both ways. I mean, you get critics saying we're giving too much, and then on the other hand, you get people saying, well, will it happen? We understood there was a stretched industrial base in both the UK and the US. That's why we made the decision to make the contribution. The contribution gives us a sense of confidence that this will happen in a way which will enable Australia to acquire this capability.
There are critics who worry the whole thing is too much of a gamble and spending too much money. One of those is Paul Keating, the former Prime Minister. Now, he met the Chinese Foreign Minister on Thursday in Sydney. Chinese state-run media were allowed in to capture the moment. Australian media were not. Richard Marles, what did you honestly think of this meeting?
Well, I don't think there's anything really remarkable about the meeting. It's it's quite common for people to come and meet former leaders, so the government's not worried about it. I mean, obviously Paul Keating is an honoured former Labor Prime Minister, but equally he doesn't speak for the government today. But we're not concerned about the meeting. The meeting that mattered to us was the meeting that happened between the two foreign ministers.
Because, I mean, the Australian media, as I say, weren't allowed in.
We saw the ongoing process of stabilising our relationship.
After the meeting, the Chinese Global Times was citing Paul Keating's views that AUKUS is the worst international decision. The submarines will see Australia surrender its sovereignty to the US, called him an insightful Australian. Was this just a propaganda exercise?
Well, again, we're not really concerned about the meeting with Paul Keating. We're not, because Paul Keating doesn't speak for the Australian government. I mean, that's the fundamental point here. And we're not going to stop people from meeting former leaders if that's what they want to do. The meeting that mattered was with our Foreign Minister, and in that meeting, the process of stabilising our relationship with China continued. But can I just make the point in relation to those who speak about AUKUS? I mean, the biggest gamble of all would be to not seek to acquire a capable, highly capable, long-range submarine capability for the future. I mean, this is the single most important military platform we have. We need it in the future, and walking down the path of nuclear propulsion is the only way we get it.
Just a couple of other issues. The Tasmanian election result last night. Do you think there's any realistic prospect that Labor could form a government?
Well, I think we're still in the hunt. Rebecca White made that clear. Obviously, there is a way to go in terms of, firstly, the counting, but then there's clearly going to be a process of negotiating the formation of government, given the way in which Tasmanians...
So they should look at governing with the Greens?
We know. Well, the one thing that really comes out of last night is that we've seen a 12% swing against the incumbent Liberal government, and that's where the key message is.
Okay, but Labor governing with the Greens, you wouldn't have a problem there?
That is all going to be a matter for Rebecca White. You'd hardly expect me to weigh in on that. Right. Rebecca is going to do what she does in over the next couple of weeks. No doubt she's going to be busy on the phone, as I'm sure all Tasmanian politicians are going to be.
They will.
One thing is, we will work as a Commonwealth government with whoever forms government in Tasmania.
Finally, Deputy Prime Minister, should religious schools be allowed to hire and fire a teacher based on whether they're gay?
Look, we've seen the Law Reform Commission report. We're obviously looking at it. What we want is to see amendments to the Sex Discrimination Act so that there is not discrimination on the basis of gender or sexual orientation, identity. Equally, we want to see legislation which prevents discrimination on the basis of faith. Now, we've been working through what is obviously a sensitive issue. The point that we've made really clearly is this. We are only going to move forward on a bipartisan basis. We've provided draft legislation to the opposition for them to consider. For us to do anything other than that, well, let me just finish. For us to do anything other than that, David, would be to move down a pathway of division. We need to see
just back to the question,
in this country. We need to see it on this issue.
This is a pretty straightforward question.
And it's now for the opposition to work out what they're going to do.
Should religious schools be able to hire and fire based on whether a teacher is gay?
But people should not be discriminated against in their employment on the basis of their sexual identity. That is really clear, and that is a clear answer to that question.
And so have you seen the draft legislation the government's drawn up and shared with the other side?
We've had that presented, and that
You've seen it?
We've shared that now. Well, we've shared it with the opposition.
But have you seen it?
It is now
You're
a
the
matter
deputy PM.
well, David, the legislation has been presented to cabinet. That what we will do is it is now a matter for the opposition as to what they do, because we are not going to walk down this path on the basis of division.
Why the secrecy around this legislation? Why can't we all have a look at it?
Oh, well, because we're in the process of seeking to negotiate this through. And what we want to do is try and achieve consensus. And when you're seeking to achieve consensus, you want the greatest space possible in order for that to occur, because we don't want to see division or to walk down a path of division in this country. And that is the one point that we've made absolutely clear here. We need to have bipartisan support. We've provided legislation to the opposition. It's now a matter for them.
All right, Richard Marles, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks, David.
All right, we're going to get into that debate around religious schools and the rights and responsibilities they should have. We're going to continue just on the submarines, though, for a moment. Back to our panel. Clare Armstrong, Anthony Galloway and Shalailah Medhora. Look, the submarine spend there, it's $4.7 billion going to beef up some of those facilities in the UK. Clare, was this always part of the plan?
We were definitely told a year ago that there would be some investment in the capability of the shipbuilding capability in the UK and the US. We were immediately told what the amount was at that time with the US to expand their submarine building capabilities. There was no dollar figure put on the UK, and it wasn't actually clear either that it would be going specifically to the contributing to the construction and the redesign of the nuclear reactor, which is what Rolls-Royce, that's what they do. So we do none of that onshore here theoretically with the SN and AUKUS. So there was a hint, but definitely I don't think anyone thought that it would be this many billions and that we didn't know exactly what it was.
Although, I mean, Richard Marles is saying there it's over the 10-year. That was interesting, that it's not going to blow out that initial cost over the 4 years, Anthony.
Yeah, but it still seems like it's the price of admission to the nuclear club, right? This $9.2 billion that we're giving collectively to the US and the UK. I mean, to me, some of this begs the question, given that we're buying between 3 and 5 Virginias from the US, why aren't we just going with Virginias with the US? Now, when that optimal pathway was announced a year ago, part of the reason was because the US is building a next generation of Virginia from 2030 or from the early 2030s. The authorisation date was 2030 back then. In Joe Biden's latest proposed budget, that's been pushed out to 2040, so they're starting to build the next generation of Virginias from the early 2040s. That actually would work perfectly with our timeline for the AUKUS submarines.
Just go with an updated Virginia class.
I don't think the government's properly answered the question. Why are we going to operate between 3 and 5 Virginia subs and then operate a significantly different platform in this AUKUS submarine?
Let's move on to religious schools and the Religious Discrimination Act. Shalailah, why is the government, you heard it there from the Deputy PM as well, insisting there's bipartisanship before they'll even release the legislation for everyone to see?
Look, they're saying that they don't want a divisive debate over this. No doubt they are considering what happened during the Voice campaign, where they went into that without bipartisanship. But I think the real question here is why the secrecy. If we're talking about a bill that is necessary, which is what they're arguing, we should be able to see what the detail of that is. We have a situation where potentially Cabinet hasn't even seen it, or all members of Cabinet haven't seen it, and they are arguing to the opposition, we need you to agree with this bill without having potentially seen the details of the bill. David, I just wanted to take you quickly to a question of who benefits from this, because ultimately for me, the question of the religious freedoms bills comes down to who is it for, right? And this is part of the reason I think we haven't seen the draft legislation quite as yet, because some of the talking points around it don't necessarily fit with what's in it. When we look at schools in Australia, 1 in 5 schools are Catholic schools. So there's around 4 million schools across Australia. 1 in 5 are Catholic schools. It's a lot of Catholic schools. It's a really, really big section of the education system. Often advocates of the Religious Discrimination Bill will bring up Islamic schools and Jewish schools. There are roughly 50 Islamic schools across the country and only 18 Jewish schools across the country. 11 of those are in Victoria. So they are a small, minute fraction of the overall education system, and yet they're being dragged into this debate as a part of the reason as why we need this. Ultimately, it's for those schools to decide individually whether or not they need these kind of provisions. But the fact is, when we're looking at this, it is often the minority sort of loudest, I guess, squeakiest wheels who are making the arguments here that don't necessarily reflect religious communities.
So just to spell out what's being discussed here, Claire, you've got the Australian Law Reform Commission report was released the other day. We can all see what it's recommending. Changes to the Sex Discrimination Act that removes that exemption that's there for religious schools at the moment, which means they can hire and fire, they can discriminate based on...
It effectively sanctions discrimination.
Now, the government's then drawn up its own legislation here. It's not telling us what's in it. It's shared it with the opposition, as we've mentioned, and some faith groups as well. Now, I'm told that they are more supportive of the draft legislation than what was recommended in the Law Reform Commission report. So there is some difference. Exactly what is hard to know, but just coming back to the Prime Minister's insistence here he was saying there needs to be bipartisanship before he's willing to move forward on this.
We have reached out. I've made it very clear from very early on in this process, in the meetings that I've had with faith leaders and others, that this needs bipartisan support, because I don't want this to be an issue in which we go through the old culture wars.
And the government's not expecting to get that bipartisan support, are they?
Well, it doesn't seem it, and I think you need to separate here. There's obviously, I agree, I think a reform like this does actually require both sides, because otherwise we are just going, it'll be like the next thing that just gets brought up every time there's a change of government. The question does need to be settled. The problem is, or the questions now are, will it look back on this and say we did everything we absolutely could to assure bipartisanship? And there are a few signs, obviously being spun very hard by the opposition, that suggest that they aren't doing all that they could in terms of when the PM came forward and said, I need bipartisanship on this. At that point in time, the opposition had not seen the bill. They hadn't seen the law reforms report.
Well, here's how Peter Dutton reacted to that.
Why did he drop it out to the caucus this morning? Was that a genuine display of a Prime Minister who wanted bipartisanship? No. It was a partisan attempt to try and quash the whole process. That's what he's after.
Eliminated any possibility of bipartisanship now?
Ultimately, the Prime Minister went to the election with a promise that's now turned into a lie.
Yeah, they gave him the draft bill the next day.
Yeah, I don't know that it's necessarily a lie to say that you want to put a condition of bipartisanship on an issue that has been as intractable as this one has. It effectively brought down the Morrison government. I mean, it was one of many things that was a big issue for the coalition in the last term. So to jump fully to, the PM's misbehaved by briefing out caucus before we saw the bill is obviously taking that argument to the furthest that Peter Dutton possibly can, equally as partisan, you might argue. But there is a core problem here, which when you start having these debates, you're not talking about protecting LGBT kids at the centre of this. You're not talking about protecting religious freedoms. You're not talking about protecting staff. It's kind of amazing that we had a week where the government managed to equally annoy religious groups as he did equality groups. That's like pretty impressive.
I think that just to that point really quickly is that's due to the vacuum of information we have, right? When you don't have the detail of draft legislation, people become scared and they jump to points and they jump to concerns, and we're seeing that equally on both sides of this conversation.
And to rule out a parliamentary inquiry, I mean, that's where Dutton really has a point, I think. That's
there have been a lot of inquiries.
There's been a lot
of inquiries.
Yeah, but into the
actual bill.
Given that we think, as you said before, David, that it differs from the ALRC.
So why can't Labor work with the Greens and crossbench on the change to the Sex Discrimination Act at least, and clear up this issue about whether they can sack a gay teacher?
Because I think they wouldn't get from them what they want on the religious protections. I think that's the answer.
And they want to do both together.
Yeah, and I think you have to read some of the voice referendum into this. Yep. I think the Prime Minister has learnt that if you don't have bipartisanship, with the coalition on an issue such as this, and you drag the country through a pretty divisive debate, it's not helpful, and you'll probably lose. And we're 12 months to an election. He doesn't want to be talking about culture wars at this point. He wants to be talking about cost of living in the economy.
And I also just have to quickly make the point that religious groups aren't a monolith, and they don't all agree with aspects of this legislation or what we assume is in this legislation. So again, you have a similar situation with the voice where, First Nations people didn't necessarily agree on the voice itself. And so that's dragging in that element as well, that you're not only pitting religious against non-religious, often you're also talking about religious people themselves.
But I think you're absolutely right. On the voice, they went without bipartisanship, big community divide, ended up with nothing, and I think they're being a lot more cautious this time around. On
the interesting thing here, and you saw it in the Dutton presser, he refused to answer the question a number of times, should religious schools be allowed to discriminate against LGBTQ staff.
Richard Marles, to his credit, took a couple of goes, but he said they should not be able to discriminate based on sexuality. But within the Liberals, what is the position at the moment?
That's my point. They are very divided on this issue, as we saw with when Morrison tried to do it. So this would really wedge the coalition, it would create a massive internal issue for them. So it really speaks to the Prime Minister's thinking that he'd probably get a political win out of this, but he doesn't want to put the country...
But there are Liberals who won't budge from the position of some of the religious schools on this, and that is they want no change on the Sex Discrimination Act. Is that right?
Yes, they're not going to get what they want in that regard. That's just like the reason these two issues have been coupled is because both sides are going to win and both sides are going to lose. And so to deal with one in isolation and then the other is just going to make that debate so much worse, because you're going to have an entire debate where it's all loss for one side and all win for the other.
All right, well, there's further talks, I think, next week between the government and the opposition on this secret draft legislation, but the expectations are this won't be going very far at all. Look, the economy, we saw some particularly strong jobs figures during the week for the month of February. Unemployment dropped to 3.7%, much better than anyone was expecting. You've still got inflation coming down. The numbers are looking pretty good, should help the budget bottom line too, you would think. But, Anthony, is the Treasurer getting excited here? The forecasts are still for economic growth to keep edging or to remain low and for unemployment to keep rising.
I guess he has to get excited about unemployment falling, and the opposition can't go too hard on that. But 3.7% is well below what the RBA considers full employment, and employment is one critical factor that the RBA takes into account when setting interest rates. So, but it's important to note that these kind of monthly figures with employment are really volatile. They've jumped around a lot in recent months. So we've got quite a few more RBA meetings and a few quarterly and monthly employment figures to come before the RBA was expected to cut the rate anyway. So.
Just quickly, Speersy, while there has been an overall drop in unemployment, that doesn't translate to youth unemployment. Youth unemployment has remained steady since October last year at 9.3%, so much higher than broader, unemployment. And also, worryingly, the participation rate is quite low. It's the lowest it's been since early 2021 at around 70%. Yeah. So there are some questions here about what's working for broader society and what really needs to be done for young people.
Yeah, and we saw a migration figure during the week too that, as expected, showed a big jump for last year. Government's working hard to bring that down. It knows how politically toxic this could be come election time.
Yeah, I think the figure was so large that it still does make it difficult to see how the MyEFO forecast of 375,000 net overseas migration will be achieved by the end of this financial year. But ultimately, the government's now put in a bunch of things, particularly reining in sort of dodgy students or people that come here ostensibly to study, but really they're working. But I think Dutton very clearly identified this a year ago in his budget reply, that this big Australia idea that he wants to tag Labor with is going to be really foundational. It connects to housing, access to infrastructure resources, education, all of those things. So Labor are going to have to get some real runs on the board in the next 12 months to show that they're managing that against population.
The issue of migration is getting pretty toxic in focus groups, both sides of politics tell me. So, I mean, we may be set for a rather kind of divisive debate.
You're a lot more about it. Look, just before we go to Talking Pictures, quick mention of this week's podcast, which focuses on homelessness. What's it like to be homeless, and what does it take to get your life back on track? I caught up with Bree Dorset and Tyra Chan-Hampton, who are ambassadors for Foyer Foundation. We spoke about being homeless and the program that turned their lives around. The QR codes are there on your screen if you'd like to check it out. All right, our panel, Shalailah Medhora, Anthony Galloway and Clare Armstrong, will be back in a moment with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with columnist for The Australian, the one and only Jack the Insider. Very warm welcome, comrade.
Thank you, mate. Yes, it's been a wonderful week.
Jack, apparently Kevin Rudd's not the brightest bulb.
Yes, according to Donald Trump.
Yeah. It's according to the very stable genius. Beautiful little Dyson here, Bulbs a Field Guide, and he's got the Kevin Rudd one here.
He's a hardy perennial, pungent. can cause irritation. Yes, we do know that. Annoyingly bright.
Yeah. And then we've got the orange bulb here.
Highly invasive, can cause nausea and or vomiting. No discernible luminescence.
Yeah, it'd be a horrible garden. You'd hope they wouldn't germinate.
Yeah, well, you couldn't put them anywhere near each other.
I did love this David Pope, Kevin 007 in Stirred But Not Shaken. My God, the vodka. And he's just
there it is.
Beautifully done, Donald, in the martini glass.
Yes, indeed. Yes, got the little orange peel for the hair.
You have a strong aftertaste, I think. The wonderful, incomparable David Rowe, not the brightest bulb, who's got Kevin here.
Well, yeah, Donald's having a light bulb moment with and there's Farage too, which is just lovely.
But illuminating nonetheless. He would be a spite-emitting diode, right?
Yes, he may well be.
The wonderful John Kudelka, who's got Kevin sharpening. Of course, Kevin's got knives.
He's got a knife collection, according to John Kudelka.
Labor Party days.
There's
right?
some pretty ugly things there, some serrations, and they look like they've all been used.
Beware, Donald, beware. A really clever Golding, I thought. The butterfly effect, he's changed to the BS flies effect. The idea that small men flapping their lips in Florida could cause a media typhoon in Australia.
Well, yes, I mean, it does raise the question, if he does win in November, will Kevin Rudd be ambassador? It'd be hard. But he's going to have to learn to flatter Donald Trump.
I thought this summed it up beautifully. It is like the schoolyard.
It is a bit, yes.
World politics, Kathy Wilcox. She said,
so apparently Kevin said some horrible things about you.
Yeah, well, I heard Kevin's nasty and he's not very bright and he's definitely not coming to my party.
He's not coming to my party. I was like, never mind Gaza.
And speaking of Gaza, there was a protest in the galleries of the House of Reps, and it was just one of those moments that struck me as like, this is going to build and build and it's not going away.
Well, yes, there seems to be no halt to the IDF's extension into Gaza.
Jack, Winston Churchill once called Russia a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma, but their election results were fairly predictable.
He's had a large swing towards, hasn't he?
Well, that kind of happens when you're the only one running. Johannes Leek. Vote for me or the democracy gets it. It's a funny thing about democracy, the mob always gets it right.
Yeah, there you go. Gun at the head, gun at the head.
You're on a list, are you not?
I am sanctioned by Russia. Yes, obviously upset Vladimir and the foreign service.
Warren Brown was a person who was pissed off that he wasn't on the list.
Yeah.
He's got Kevin Rudd here. For the upcoming Trump presidency, Kevin reevaluated his image.
He's gone with the QAnon shaman.
Yeah, well, he could be the programmatic specificity shaman. How do I look?
Yeah, he looks great. Yeah.
Well, kind of.
Not great.
What can we learn from the Russian election?
Don't wait to claim it was stolen, just steal it. Just pinch it first.
Steal early, steal often. Anne Telnays, who's an American cartoonist, says, congratulations, Vladimir, with absolutely fixed. Nostrovia, my friend.
Yeah, nice drawing of Putin too.
Lovely drawing of Putin. Look, it's been a great pleasure unpicking the events this week with you, and I'll let you do the honours, Jack.
Thanks, Mike. And it's back to you, Spearsy.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Mike. Time for some final observations. Quick one from me. The government's expected to introduce its vehicle emission standard legislation to Parliament this week. It's made some adjustments. Chris Bowen flagged some of them on the program a couple of weeks ago. It's been talking to industry groups who've been worried about the scale of ambition in the plan, so we'll see where that ends up in the legislation. Shalailah.
So March is Endometriosis Awareness Month, and there have been some real wins in this space, particularly around awareness and education of this often debilitating disease that affects around 1 in 7 women and non-binary people. But the question still remains, where is the money? We still haven't had any allocations towards research or clinical pain management for people with this condition. So I know a lot of advocates are now hoping that during this month we might see a little bit of extra funding put towards it.
Yeah, good. Anthony.
There's been a bit of debate internally within Labor for quite some time about when the Prime Minister will do his first reshuffle. The PM has always said he just wants to do a small one and just before the election to make to just account for the people who are retiring. So that would point to, say, December this year. But there's just been renewed chatter among Cabinet colleagues about whether he goes a bit earlier. And that has all everything to do really with concern about the management of Home Affairs, particularly the fallout of the NZYQ case.
Interesting. Claire?
In a few days, it's 1 year since US journalist Evan Gershkovich was detained in Russia. He remains in prison, as far as we know, no charges other than essentially being a journalist in a country like Russia. His arrest signalled the departure of the last Western journalists in that country. I think it's an important, timely reminder to, one, keep the public pressure on and advocating for his release, but also that the democracy needs journalism, and we know there's no democracy in Russia and there's no journalism.
Yeah, well said. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Finally, ever wondered how politicians feel after being subjected to a searching interview with Sarah Ferguson on 7:30? Well, even a former British Prime Minister needed a steadier the other night. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
Well, I've just done one of your makeshift media interviews at 7:30. Oh, very good. So I hear the dream up there. Yeah, well.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.